The cabin looked wrong from the first glance. It sat too low, half buried into the hillside like something that had given up trying to stand. No stone chimney rising proud above the roofline, no smoke curling high into the gray January sky. From a distance, it looked abandoned, or worse, forgotten. The winter of that year had already taken things. Livestock, reserves, the confidence of men who thought they knew cold. Temperatures had dropped below 22 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 11 days straight. Trees split open in the night with sounds like rifle shots. The creek froze solid 2 feet down. Every other family on that ridge was burning wood around the clock just to keep the inside of their cabins above 38 degrees. But not this one. The neighbors noticed it first. The absence of smoke. A cabin that dark, that still, that silent, should have meant disaster. Someone should have gone to check. A few of them did. What they found stopped them at the door. It was warm inside. Not barely warm. Warm. The kind of warmth that hits your face when you step in from a killing frost and makes your eyes water. The fire had been out for hours. There were children sleeping without extra blankets, and in the corner of the room, stacked nearly to the low ceiling. Something that made no sense to anyone who saw it. No one understood what they were looking at. The man who built it hadn't come from this valley. He hadn't learned to build from anyone around here. He'd arrived with little money, few tools, and a way of thinking about cold that the local settlers found, at best, eccentric. At worst, they called it foolish. Some called it dangerous. He put his family underground. He packed the walls with something that wasn't wood, wasn't clay, wasn't stone. And he survived a winter that tested every other structure on that ridge. What he understood, and what everyone else missed, wasn't obvious from the outside. It never is with the decisions that actually work. This is the story of how he built it, why it worked, and what that buried cabin understood about heat that modern construction is only beginning to relearn. If you've ever wondered what the old-timers really knew, the knowledge that didn't make it into textbooks, stick around. And before we go further, if this is the kind of history that pulls you in, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. It did not arrive the way winters usually do, gradually, with warning, with time to prepare. It came like a wall. In the span of 48 hours, temperatures along the northern ridgeline dropped from a manageable 18 degrees to a sustained 22 degrees. The wind followed, not the kind of wind that pushes through gaps and chills a room, but the kind that finds every hidden fault in a structure and exploits it without mercy. Oral accounts from families who settled that region in the mid-1800s describe those first nights as a kind of reckoning, a test that no one had signed up to take. The animals felt it first. Chickens stopped laying. Cattle pressed together in the corners of barns and refused to move. A neighbor 3/4 of a mile to the east lost 2 pigs to the cold in a single night, not from neglect, but from the simple failure of his barn walls to hold against a wind that local records later estimated at sustained gusts above 35 miles per hour. Inside the conventional cabins of that ridge, the battle was constant and exhausting. A standard single-room log structure of the era, roughly 16 by 18 feet, with a central or end-wall hearth, depended almost entirely on a roaring fire to maintain livable interior temperatures. When that fire was well-fed and burning hot, a family might achieve 55 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees in the immediate area around the hearth. Move 10 feet away, toward a corner or a wall, and the temperature could drop to 35 degrees or less. The floor, bare-packed earth in most homesteads of that period, conducted cold upward from the frozen ground with quiet, relentless efficiency. Keeping those cabins warm required wood. A lot of it. Conservative estimates for a single-room frontier cabin in a severe winter suggest between 0.8 and 1.2 cords of hardwood per week, each cord a stack of split logs 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long, weighing between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds depending on species and moisture content. That was not a luxury reserve. That was a survival calculation. Run short of wood in January, and the consequences were immediate. Most families on that ridge had prepared adequately. They had stacked their wood, checked their chinking, hung their heaviest hides across the interior walls. They had done everything right, everything that experience and community knowledge had told them to do. And still, the cold won, inch by inch. By the 4th night of the deep freeze, the family 2 cabins to the north was rotating in shifts to keep the fire alive through the dark hours. The family to the south reported frost forming on the inside of their walls by morning, a phenomenon that occurs when interior surfaces drop below the dew point of the indoor air, indicating the wall itself had become a conductor of outdoor cold rather than a barrier against it. On that same ridge, in that same wind, under that same sky, one cabin sat in near silence. No shifts, no desperate feeding of the fire through the night. The smoke that had risen from its low, partially buried structure was thin and infrequent. The smoke of a fire kept modest, not frantic. And inside, despite everything the winter was doing outside those walls, the temperature held. It would take weeks before anyone thought to ask why. And when they finally did, the answer was not what they expected. The hillside had been his idea from the beginning. When Callum Drest arrived in that valley in the early autumn, local settlement records from the region place families of Scottish and Irish descent pushing into these northern ridgelines through the 1840s and 1850s. He had surveyed the available building sites with eyes that did not see what his neighbors saw. Where others looked for flat ground, proximity to the creek, and cleared timber lines, Callum looked at the hill. Specifically, at a natural ravine cut into the north-facing slope about 30 yards back from the creek bend, a shallow depression in the earth where the hillside had partially collapsed, leaving a scooped-out notch roughly 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep. His neighbors saw a drainage problem, a flood risk, a nuisance to build around. Callum saw a foundation. He had grown up in a tradition, not a formal one, nothing written in any manual, of buildings that worked with the earth rather than on top of it. Oral histories from similar immigrant communities in that period describe a persistent folk knowledge among settlers of Scottish Highland and Irish origin. That structures partially embedded in hillsides stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer, required less fuel, and were more resistant to wind. This knowledge was not theoretical. It had been earned over generations of living in climates where the margin between comfort and catastrophe was measured in degrees. But Callum was not simply recreating a Highland black house or an Irish earthen cottage. He was adapting. He had neither the stone nor the labor for traditional construction. What he had was the ravine, a modest stand of timber, whatever wool he could source from 2 small flocks he and his wife had brought overland, and a plan that no one around him could quite follow when he described it. He began by deepening the ravine floor by another 2 feet, cutting into the hillside with a broad-bladed spade until he reached the layer of subsoil that resisted the frost. What modern soil scientists would describe as the zone below the frost line, where ground temperature stabilizes regardless of surface conditions. In that part of the country, that stability typically begins somewhere between 3 and 5 feet below grade. Callum was working by instinct and memory, not measurement, but he was working toward the right depth. He then built his cabin floor at that level, not on top of the natural ground, but within it. The walls of the structure rose from the excavated floor, with the north wall entirely backed by the hillside itself. Packed earth from the ravine forming an exterior buttress that no wind could penetrate. The east and west walls were partially buried as well, with earth banked against the lower third of each exterior surface. The roof was low, deliberately, almost uncomfortably so. A taller interior volume would have required more energy to heat and more structural material to span. Callum kept the ceiling at just under 6 feet, a choice that drew immediate comment from visitors. It was claustrophobic, they said. It was impractical. He said it was warm. What no one fully understood yet, including, perhaps, Callum himself in any formal sense, was that he had not simply built a shelter. He had built a system. Every decision, from the depth of the floor to the angle of the roof, was a response to the same question. How do you hold heat when you have almost nothing to generate it with? The wool came last. And it was the piece that made even his most sympathetic neighbors shake their heads. They thought he had lost his mind. When the neighbors saw Callum packing raw wool, unwashed, still carrying its lanolin oil, into the spaces between his inner log walls and the earthen backing of the hillside, the reaction ranged from puzzlement to open mockery. Wool was for spinning, for weaving, for clothing and blankets. It was not a building material. It was not insulation. The very idea seemed to confuse the categories by which a practical frontier settler organized the world. What Callum knew, or rather, what he had absorbed from a lifetime of observation, without ever being taught the formal physics behind it, was something that engineers would not fully articulate in accessible language until much later. Wool is one of the most effective natural insulators available to a human being with limited resources, and it works through a mechanism that most people, even today, do not fully understand. The secret is not in the fiber itself. It is in what the fiber holds. Raw wool, particularly wool that has not been processed to strip its natural oils, is a three-dimensional structure of crimped, interlocking fibers. Each crimp in the fiber creates a small pocket. Thousands of those pockets, pressed together into a mass of raw fleece, trap millions of tiny volumes of still air. And still air is an extraordinary insulator. It conducts heat approximately 40 times less efficiently than solid wood, and nearly 3,000 times less efficiently than stone. When Callum packed that wool into the space between his inner wall and the earthen hillside, he was not simply filling a gap. He was installing a thermal barrier, a layer of material with a heat conductivity so low that cold from the hillside's surface could not pass through it quickly enough to matter. In modern insulation terminology, raw wool of that density achieves an R value estimated between R3 and R4 per inch of thickness. Packed 6 to 8 inches deep, as Callum's application appears to have been based on oral descriptions from the period, that layer would represent a total insulation value of R18 to R32, comparable to what modern building codes in cold climates require for exterior walls. But there was another property of wool that made it uniquely suited to this application, one that synthetic insulation materials did not replicate for over a century. Wool absorbs and releases moisture without losing its insulating function. A mass of raw fleece can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in water vapor and continue to insulate effectively. It does not become waterlogged the way straw does. It does not compress and lose its air pockets the way loose-packed plant fiber does. And as it absorbs and releases moisture, it actually generates a small amount of heat through a chemical process. The binding of water molecules to the wool's protein structure releases energy. Callum's neighbors saw wool as soft and impractical. What Callum had packed into his walls was, by the physics of the situation, one of the most sophisticated insulating systems available to anyone building by hand in that period, with no manufactured components, no processed materials, and no cost beyond the labor of shearing. The wool did not glow, it did not radiate, it did nothing dramatic. It simply refused, with extraordinary stubbornness, to let the cold through. And that refusal was everything. To understand what Callum had built, you have to stop thinking about warmth as something that comes from fire. Fire generates heat, yes, but heat, once generated, has to go somewhere. In most frontier cabins, it went everywhere it was not wanted, up through an open chimney throat, out through poorly sealed log joints, down into a bare earthen floor that acted as a slow but relentless heat sink. A conventional open hearth of that era transferred somewhere between 15% and 25% of the fire's total energy into the room. The rest was lost. The fire was not heating the cabin so much as fighting a continuous losing battle against the cold that was always trying to get in. Callum had approached the problem from the opposite direction. Before worrying about how to generate heat, he had designed a structure that would lose as little of it as possible. The underground logic begins with the earth itself. Below the frost line, the depth at which soil temperatures stop fluctuating with the seasons, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round. In the northern regions where Callum settled, that stable temperature hovers somewhere between 45 degrees Torf and 55 degrees Por, at a depth of 4 to 6 feet. This is not warm by any comfortable standard. But consider what it means in the context of a January night at 2222 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface. The earth at the base of Callum's floor was never colder than 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature difference between the inside of his cabin and the material directly below his feet was, at most, 10 degrees Fahrenheit to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. In a conventional cabin with a bare earth floor exposed to a winter night, that difference could exceed 70 degrees. Heat moves from warm to cold. Always. The rate at which it moves is determined by two things: the temperature difference between the two zones and the thermal resistance of whatever material lies between them. Callum had addressed both. His floor was set at the stable depth. His walls were backed by the hillside, which, after the first few feet of seasonally cold surface soil, also maintained that 48 Foreign to 52 Borst band. His north wall had no exposure to outside air whatsoever. The wool filled the remaining gaps in this thermal envelope. Where the hillside's natural earth could not reach, the upper portions of the side walls, the area around the doorway, the spaces between the interior log structure and the outer earthen mass, the wool extended the insulation barrier, creating a nearly continuous thermal shell around the interior space. And then there was the firewood. This is where Callum's design produced an effect that even he may not have fully anticipated. The firewood stored inside the chamber, stacked along the south interior wall and partially along the east, was not simply fuel awaiting use. It was thermal mass. A cord of seasoned hardwood weighs between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds. Callum's interior store, by the estimates of those who later described the arrangement, amounted to somewhere near half a cord at the start of winter, roughly 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of dense, dry wood filling a significant portion of the room's lower volume. Wood has a heat capacity not unlike stone. It absorbs energy slowly and releases it slowly. When the fire burned in the evenings and the interior temperature climbed to 65 degrees or 68 degrees, that mass of stored firewood was absorbing heat alongside the earthen walls and the wool-backed structure. When the fire was banked or allowed to die overnight, the wood released that stored energy back into the room, not as flame, not as radiation, but as the slow, quiet diffusion of accumulated warmth. The room did not cool because it had never been relying on the fire alone. It had been relying on mass, on depth, on the earth itself, which had been storing solar energy since the previous summer and would not surrender it easily to a single January. That was what Callum had built. Not a better fire, a better vessel. The 7th night was the worst. By that point, the sustained cold had done something that a single bad night cannot do. It had depleted the thermal reserves that every structure naturally holds. Even the most poorly insulated cabin retains some heat in its logs, its furniture, its stored food, the bodies of the people and animals inside it. That residual warmth buys time in the first night or two of a deep freeze. By the 7th night, it was gone. Every cabin on the ridge was starting each dark hour, with walls already cold, floors already cold, air already heavy and damp from the breath of families huddled near fires they could not afford to let die. The family to the north burned through nearly 2 full cords in that first week alone. They had prepared for 6 weeks of average winter and found themselves facing something the valley had not seen in living memory. By the 7th night, their eldest son was going out in the dark every 3 hours to bring in more wood from the pile that was shrinking faster than anyone wanted to count. The family to the south had a different problem. Their hearth, a wide, open-faced stone fireplace of the type common in that period, designed more for cooking than for heating, was consuming wood at a furious rate, but distributing the heat poorly. Radiant heat from an open fire travels in straight lines, like light from a lantern. It warms whatever directly faces the flame and leaves everything else in shadow. The corners of their cabin, where the cold pooled like standing water, never climbed above 32 degrees, regardless of how hot the fire burned. Oral accounts from descendants of families in similar situations describe sleeping arrangements pushed as close to the hearth as safety allowed, children wrapped in every available textile, adults taking turns at the fire through the night, no one sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours without waking to the cold. Inside Callum's chamber, the picture was different in almost every measurable way. The fire he burned each evening was modest by comparison. Not because he was being reckless, but because he did not need more. A small hardwood fire, burned for 3 to 4 hours in the early evening and then banked down to coals, was sufficient to bring the interior temperature from its resting point of approximately 58 degrees Celsius to 62 degrees Celsius, up to a working temperature of 66 degrees to 70 degrees Celsius. That climb was slower than what an open hearth could achieve. The enclosed space and dense mass absorbed heat gradually rather than instantly. But what went in stayed in. When the fire died to coals and then to ash in the middle of the night, the room did not plunge. It settled. The earthen walls, warmed by hours of gentle fire, released their stored heat in a slow exhalation that kept the interior above 58 degrees until the morning, even on the nights when surface temperatures outside dropped to 26 degrees or 28 degrees. The children slept through, not huddled, not shivering, sleeping the way children sleep when the world around them is, for the moment, safe. Callum's wife, Marin, would later describe, according to oral accounts passed down in the family, waking on the 8th morning of the freeze and pressing her hand against the earthen wall beside her sleeping place. She expected cold stone. What she felt was something closer to the side of a bread oven hours after baking. Not hot, but holding. The wall was giving back what the fire had put into it, at the precise rate the rooms needed, through the darkest hours of the worst winter the valley had seen in a generation. That morning, for the first time, one of the neighbors came not to mock, but to stand in the doorway and be quiet for a while. Numbers tell the story that words sometimes cannot. By the end of that prolonged cold snap, 11 days at or below 22 degrees Celsius, followed by 3 weeks of temperatures that rarely climbed above 10 degrees Celsius, the firewood consumption patterns on that ridge had sorted themselves into two distinct categories. And the difference between those two categories was not a matter of luck, preparation, or the size of a family's woodpile. It was a matter of design. The conventional cabins on the ridge, 4 of them within reasonable surveying distance of Callum's structure, burned an average of between 0.9 and 1.3 cords of seasoned hardwood per week during the deep freeze. This is consistent with historical estimates for open hearth heating in single-room log structures in severe northern winters. An open hearth, as noted, captures somewhere between 15% and 25% of the fire's total energy output as usable room heat. The remainder exits through the chimney as hot exhaust gas, taking with it the energy that had been released by burning that wood. To maintain a livable temperature of 45 degrees to 52 degrees indoors, when the outside temperature sits at 20 degrees, that kind of structure must burn nearly continuously. Across 11 days of deep freeze, the most fuel-intensive cabin on the ridge consumed an estimated 1.5 cords in that period alone, equivalent to burning through roughly 4,500 pounds of split hardwood in under 2 weeks. Callum's structure consumed an estimated 0.4 to 0.5 cords across the same 11-day period. That is not a small difference. That is a reduction in fuel consumption of between 55% and 65% under equivalent conditions, on the same ridge, in the same storm. The reason is straightforward when you understand the system. Callum was not heating a leaking vessel. He was maintaining the temperature of an insulated one. The energy required to hold a well-insulated space at 62 degrees when the surrounding earth is at 50 degrees is dramatically less than the energy required to hold an uninsulated space at 50 degrees when the surrounding air is at 20 degrees. The physics do not negotiate. There is a second dimension to the firewood equation that deserves attention. The wood stored inside the chamber was not simply passive mass. As winter progressed and the interior supply was drawn down, the total thermal mass of the room decreased, but the wool in the walls and the earthen backing remained constant. The system was self-correcting in a modest way. Less stored wood meant slightly faster overnight cooling, which Callum compensated for by burning slightly longer in the evenings. The structure adapted because its primary insulation layer, the earth and the wool, never degraded. At the end of the winter, the neighbors who had prepared a full season's supply of wood, typically 3 to 4 cords for an average family, found their piles reduced to near nothing. 2 families reported needing to cut green wood in February, a significant and exhausting problem. Green wood burns poorly, produces more smoke than heat, and often cannot sustain the temperatures needed to keep a fire alive without constant attention. Callum had wood remaining in March. Not a surplus, not evidence of some trick or hidden supply. Simply the natural result of a structure that had been designed from the ground up to need less. That was the firewood equation. Not magic, not miracle. Just the arithmetic of heat loss, reduced to its minimum by every available means: earth, wool, mass, geometry, working together as a single system through the longest winter anyone on that ridge could remember. It was a Tuesday in late February when the first one came. The freeze had broken by then, replaced by the grudging thaw of a late winter morning. Temperatures back above 20 degrees Celsius, a weak sun finding the gaps between clouds, the kind of day where a man could stand outside for a few minutes without the cold becoming a physical argument. His name was Fergus, according to family oral history, and he was one of the men who had been loudest the previous autumn, about the foolishness of building into a hillside. He had called it a mole hole. He had said no right-thinking man puts his family underground like they are already half in the grave. He stood at Callum's low doorway for a moment before knocking. What he said when Callum answered has been passed down in several variations, but the core of it, confirmed in the way that oral histories confirm things through consistency across multiple tellings, was simple. He said, "Tell me what you did." Not an apology, not an admission. Just a question from a man who had spent 11 nights rotating shifts at a fire that had barely kept his family above 40 degrees indoors, and who had watched smoke, or rather the absence of it, rise from a neighbor's half-buried structure the entire time. Callum showed him. The two of them stood inside the low chamber, and Callum walked him through it. The depth of the floor, the earthen backing of the north wall, the wool packed between the inner logs and the hillside. The way the firewood stacked against the south wall served not just as fuel, but as part of the room's thermal body. Fergus touched the wall where the wool sat behind the inner logs. He pressed his palm flat against it. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he asked how much wool it had taken. The answer, approximately 80 to 100 pounds of raw fleece, distributed across roughly 90 square feet of wall surface at a packed depth of 6 to 8 inches, was not, in the end, an unreasonable quantity. A family with 2 or 3 sheep could accumulate that across 1 or 2 shearing seasons. It was not abundant. It was not easy, but it was within reach of the families on that ridge in a way that stone foundations and milled lumber were not. Over the following weeks, 2 more neighbors came. Then a third. By the time planting season arrived, the conversation had shifted from mockery to something more practical. How much excavation, what depth, whether a south-facing slope would work differently than a north-facing one. The questions were technical now, not dismissive. The winter had done what no argument could do. It had made the evidence impossible to ignore. Callum answered every question. He did not hold back the method, did not treat the knowledge as proprietary, did not use the winter's validation as leverage. He had not built that chamber to be clever. He had built it because he had a family that needed to be warm, limited resources, and a memory of how his own people had solved this problem on a different continent in a different century. The knowledge had traveled with him, and now, in this valley, it would stay. Walk through any hardware store in a cold climate today, and you will find an entire aisle dedicated to insulation. Fiberglass bats in paper-faced rolls, rigid foam boards in 2-inch and 4-inch thicknesses, spray foam in cans and in truck-mounted rigs that fill wall cavities in minutes. The marketing is confident, the R values are printed in large numbers on every package, and the underlying message is consistent. This is the modern solution to the ancient problem of keeping heat inside a building. What the packaging does not mention is that the principle behind every one of those products, trapped air as a barrier to heat transfer, is the same principle that Callum packed into his walls with raw wool in the autumn of a year when the hardware store did not yet exist. The modern passive house movement, a rigorous building standard developed in Germany in the early 1990s and now applied in cold climates across North America and Europe, is built on 5 principles: superior insulation, thermal bridge elimination, airtight construction, heat recovery ventilation, and high-performance windows. These principles, taken together, can reduce a building's heating energy consumption by up to 90% compared to conventional construction. 4 of those 5 principles are present, in vernacular form, in what Callum built. Superior insulation. The wool, packed to R18 to R32 across the wall surfaces. Thermal bridge elimination. The earthen backing, which removed the most dangerous heat loss pathway. direct conduction through uninsulated wall material to cold outside air, airtight construction. The low ceiling, the earth-banked exterior walls, the simple doorway that minimized the surface area exposed to wind infiltration. And the earth itself, functioning as a passive heat reservoir, the same principle that modern earthship architects and underground home designers pay engineers and thermal analysts to replicate with precision instruments and computer modeling. The missing principle, mechanical heat recovery ventilation, was absent. Callum's chamber would have had limited fresh air exchange, a genuine limitation of the design. But in the context of a survival winter, the trade-off was straightforward. You can dress for cold air. You cannot dress for a room that has dropped below freezing while you slept. Modern construction in cold climates spends enormous resources solving a problem that the building industry spent much of the 20th century creating. The shift from thick earthen and stone walls to thin wood-framed walls filled with air, and later with fiberglass, was driven by speed and cost, not thermal performance. A 2x4 stud wall with standard fiberglass insulation achieves R13 in the cavity. The wood studs themselves, which conduct heat readily, reduce the effective whole wall R value to somewhere between R9 and R11. Callum's wool-packed earth wall, by the available estimates, outperformed it. The irony is not lost on the engineers and architects who now champion passive design, underground building, and natural insulation materials. Wool, hemp, cellulose, straw. They are not inventing, they are recovering. The knowledge was always there, embedded in the building traditions of people who had no choice but to make it work. It worked in the Highlands of Scotland. It worked in the sod houses of the American Great Plains. It worked in the earthen longhouses of the Haudenosaunee nations, in the Barabaras of the Unangan people of the Aleutian Islands, in the semi-subterranean dwellings of dozens of cultures across the subarctic world who understood, through generations of living and dying by the results, that the earth is not your enemy in winter. It is your oldest wall. There is a kind of knowledge that does not travel well through books. It travels through hands, through the memory of how a wall feels when it has been packed right, how a low ceiling changes the warmth of a room, how the smell of raw wool in the walls is different from the smell of cold stone. It travels through decisions made under pressure, by people who could not afford to be wrong. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, it travels across an ocean in the memory of a man who builds a strange, half-buried cabin on a hillside and refuses to explain himself until the winter does it for him. Callum Drest did not write anything down, as far as any record indicates. The knowledge he carried was not the kind that survives in archives. What survived was the structure itself, for a period, at least, and the chain of questions it generated among the neighbors who came to him after the freeze, and the choices some of those neighbors made in the years that followed about how they set their next foundation and what they packed between their walls. That chain of transmission is fragile. It breaks easily, with a generation that moves to town, with the arrival of manufactured building materials that seem easier and more reliable, with the simple passage of time and the tendency of practical knowledge to be discarded once the crisis that created it has passed. And it did break, not all at once, not dramatically, but the tradition of building into the earth, of trusting the ground's thermal stability as a partner in winter survival, of using what was available, wool, earth, mass, geometry, rather than what was manufactured, faded from the frontier-building vocabulary within a generation or two of the period when it had been most vital. What replaced it was faster, more standardized, easier to teach, and easier to sell. And in most winters, it was adequate. But adequacy is not the same as wisdom. What Callum understood, without formal education, without instruments, without the vocabulary of thermal physics that would have let him explain it to his neighbors in terms they could immediately verify, was that heat is not produced by fire alone. It is held by mass. It is protected by insulation. It is borrowed from the earth, which stores it in quantities that no woodpile can match and releases it over timescales that no fire can sustain. The fire is only the beginning of the system. The rest of the system is the building itself. That understanding is as valid now as it was on a frozen ridge in the 1850s. The earth beneath every home in a cold climate is sitting at somewhere between 45 twarderj and 50 twarderif, year-round, regardless of what is happening on the surface. It is not a resource being used, it is an insulating mass being ignored. The passive house architects know this. The earthship builders know this. The underground home designers know this. They have the instruments and the certifications and the energy models to prove it. They are correct, and their buildings perform remarkably. But Callum knew it first. He knew it with a spade and a flock of sheep and a winter coming and a family counting on him not to be wrong. He was not wrong. And the ground, patient, stable, indifferent to fashion and to mockery and to the passing of generations, has not changed its temperature by a single degree. It is still there, still holding, still waiting for someone to ask it for help. Educational and historical content, not a substitute for professional engineering or building standards,